Removing an injured athlete from competition because you want the sport to look more professional, it sort of makes sense. Telling them it's because they have an unfair advantage over the uninjured athletes they're competing against, that's a little bit harder to understand. So here we are, 2 weeks into semi-finals, and the topic that everyone's speaking about that no one was expecting to be talking about is the fact that CrossFit chose to withdraw athletes from semi-finals because they were unable to complete a test due to an injury, despite the fact there was no minimum work requirement, even when asked specifically if that would be a factor. Now, on the surface, an athlete being injured and unable to complete part of the workout and then being withdrawn from competition would make sense to a lot of people. Generally speaking, sports don't want people competing when they're injured. Just how many sports films have that as a subplot where an athlete is injured and they are maybe hiding that injury because they still want to be able to play in the big game? Yes, I'm looking at you, D2, the Mighty Ducks. So considering the constant outcry from people to have CrossFit be more professional as a sport, this decision to withdraw athletes, it sort of makes sense. But the problem in this particular case is that, one, there was no minimum work requirement, and secondly, a number of other athletes also scored a 0 in this workout. Now, of course, not all zeros are created equal. You could have an athlete that is exerting tremendous effort, really trying their best, and they just cannot get that movement, and somebody else could pull up a chair and sit down and have a rest. But still, telling an injured athlete that they have an unfair advantage over other athletes that are not injured, or to borrow from Adrian Bosman, it doesn't quite pass the sniff test. And at this point, you can have a difference of opinion. There will be people that say, it's a sport, this is part of the game. If you are saving yourself for a later part of the competition, you're willing to risk getting a lower score because you think you can make up for it with an even better score down the line, that's part of the game. Still, others will say, well, it's not the spirit of competition. In fact, we know how we felt during the Open when we saw people that were really not trying with the shuttle runs and burpee pull-ups and then putting up an incredible 1-rep max thruster. So this is part of the conversation, but another word that we need to throw in there is precedent, because this was a big issue for many people, particularly in the case of Alex Caron, because in 2018 he got injured at the CrossFit Games, slipping on a wet platform, but was then able to continue the competition, even wearing a boot, to the applause of the crowd. So at that point in time, this was not an issue for CrossFit. And of course, we can go back through the history of the CrossFit Games or Games season, and we can find out many examples of people who were unable to perform portions of the overall test due to injury or even inability. We're thinking of Catherine and the pegboard, but were still able to continue on in the competition and it wasn't a problem. But here's the thing, can we look back to these examples and use that as precedent for what we're seeing now? Well, we can't if we want to keep making the claim that CrossFit needs to be more professional, because we're giving them the ultimate get out of jail free card. They can just say that this is more professional. So when it comes to the issue of precedent, we don't need to look back at what's gone before, but we should be looking at what does this decision mean as precedent going forward, particularly as this happened in week 1 of the semi-finals. So now we know that if someone is injured and unable to complete all of the tests due to that injury, well, they should be removed from competition. That is the only fair thing to do, considering the precedent that's already been set. So what would that mean going forward with this precedent? Well, one thing, would athletes even reveal when they had an injury? Would it not be better for them to just put on a brave face, do a terrible performance, even risk aggravating the injury further, just so they don't get removed from the competition? Or what about after the fact, once the competition is over and we find out an athlete is injured? Should we retroactively go back and start removing scores from the leaderboard? How would that affect the final standings? And why not, let's just throw in a final wrinkle. What about the team competition? As this weekend we saw Invictus putting on an incredible performance, but due to an injury in Test 5, Jorge Fernandez did not perform any of the lifts. But he had a teammate. Joshua Alchama was able to perform all of the cleans, and therefore the team was able to continue on. In fact, they came third in the following test and finished second overall in the competition. So of course the big difference here is that the work got done. Because they were on a team, one athlete is able to compensate for the other. But doesn't that just re-raise the initial question? Why were the other athletes removed in week 1? Because if it's about protecting the athlete's health, protecting the reputation of CrossFit, then really should Jorge Fernandez have been allowed to continue on in test 6, considering he was unable to lift the barbell in test 5? Should that team not have been removed from competition? And Jorge, you know that I'm not asking CrossFit to do that. We've spoken numerous times and you know I've backed you from the very start. But if that's not the reason, and it's because that injury meant they couldn't get a good enough score on a particular test, well now every time an athlete is scoring a 0 on a test, we need to send them to medical. We need to check that the reason is inability, not injury. And then, of course, we circle back to the idea of, well, athletes will just hide injuries because they'd rather be known as someone who cannot complete a test than somebody who was not able to complete a test due to injury and therefore being removed from the competition. And once again, we are left with a strange situation that just seems always to be at the discretion of CrossFit. And as always with these things, it just opens a door so that people can look in and criticize every time they see a discrepancy in the application of this rule. Especially if it looks like CrossFit is favoring one athlete over another, and even worse if they believe there is a reason for that. So ultimately, does this lead to progress in CrossFit becoming more professional, or is this just a problematic precedent that is going to cause more complications down the line? Well, you tell me.